Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. This month's guest is the wonderful Dr. Christian Greer. Reading from his Academia.edu page, and I would recommend taking a look there for more of his work, it states, his PhD research concerned the complexities, contradictions, and assumptions within post-World War II North American counterculture. Specifically, his research analyzes the interplay between heterodox religious discourses and the birth of hip culture. After holding a teaching fellowship at Yale University, he accepted an adjunct teaching position at the University of Amsterdam. He is now a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for the Study of World Religion, located at Harvard University. Christian and I will be talking about the concept of humor as it relates to religion and or spirituality, and also about Discordianism, an enigmatic group that arose out of the same environment or milieu as the Beat Generation and the hippie movement in the United States. I found our discussion to be very interesting and enjoyable, and hope you will too. In part one, Christian will go into the history of the concept of laughter found in American religion and spirituality, as well as talking about the term psychedelicism and the ways that psychedelics were viewed with regard to spiritual growth. We then get into the Discordians, their history, their ideas about chaos and hoaxes, and how Lee Harvey Oswald and the Kennedy assassination fits into the picture. Okay, let's go. Welcome to the podcast, Christian, and thank you for joining me today for what I am sure will be a very interesting discussion. I've got quite a lot of material that I'd like to cover with you today, but we're going to have to start somewhere. So let's start with the concept of humor. You're going to have to forgive me, but while I was doing my reading in preparation for this discussion, I remember coming across something that I now cannot find anymore. And I didn't write it down the first time I saw it, and I'm kicking myself for that. But I'll do my best to paraphrase, and maybe you'll recognize what I'm saying when I'm talking about it, and you'll be able to put some finer points on it. Okay, so it had something to do with the idea of duality or balance, such as two sides of one coin. And with regard to humor and religion, there was a sentiment that the approach or the way people thought about religion was out of balance, as it was too far focused on seriousness. And it wasn't addressing the flip side, which is humor. And that you had to have this, you also had to have humor to, I don't even know what, I can't even remember what the exact sentiment was.
Let me just
but does this ring a bell?
Here.
Does this ring a bell? Okay.
It's really, I mean, come on, this is like too nice of you to set me up with such a technical point that I happen to remember. Let's not take this as an indication of my recall abilities. But first, I should just say how happy I am to be here with you.
I'm really sorry. I didn't even ask you to respond.
We talked before.
Like,
let's we can let the cat out of the bag. We're friends here. We chat, and I'm a big fan of the show. I really like the interviews you do, and it's really such a pleasure to be talking.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I was just so gung ho about going on with this interview. So, oh my God! All right.
No, I'm flattered.
I'm really sorry.
So eager. But yeah, humor. It's a funny thing.
Yeah, we're laughing.
I know. I happen to know what you're talking about. It's a page taken from the 4th edition of the Principia Discordia, which is often looked at as one of the central texts within Discordianism or within the history of the Discordian society. So you've put your finger on what I consider to be a really important piece of the Discordian doctrine, which really explains their approach to humor and what it means to them. Now, yeah, if I could draw your attention, I think as professors are wont to say, if I could draw your attention to page 61 of the 4th/5th edition of the Lupanix version of the Principia. Okay, that's not important. What is important, of course, is in this text, this real central text within the history of this psychedelic fellowship called Discordianism. They have a page devoted to defining how they're different from all of the other forms of occultism circulating at the time. And this would be the late 1950s, early 1960s. So you have this group really putting its flag down and saying, here's the way in which we're different. Humor. And they go a little bit further. May I read this particular passage? I have it to hand here.
Please do.
Oh, great. So magicians, especially since the Gnostic and the Kabbalistic influences, have sought higher consciousness through the assimilation and control of universal opposites, good, evil, positive, negative, male, female, etc. But due to the steadfast pomposity of ritual inherited from the ancient methods of the shaman, occultists have been blind to what is perhaps the most important pair of apparent or earth plane opposites: order, disorder, and humor, seriousness. So there we have the Discordian Society, which really stands at the origin of the psychedelic church movement. So this is a really important group, and this really important group really defines itself by its acceptance of humor, or as they like to say, by taking humor seriously.
Okay. So I'm
so glad I found that. Oh my God, that's so cool.
Yeah, because this was not planned. Really, this was not planned at all. And I'm kind of surprised that you had that so close at hand. But okay, it was meant to be. Okay, so
and we don't get to choose what we remember.
That's right.
I mean, for whatever reason.
That's right. Okay, so we're actually now already like halfway into the material that I wanted to ask you about. So we're going to have to take a few steps back because the question that I wanted to start with was actually the history of the concept of laughter. And you've already now established that this was the Discordians who were talking about this. But for the listeners who may not know who the Discordians were/are, maybe it would be a good idea to go back in time and talk about the history. So you talk about the history of the concept of laughter in your essay called "Religion Can't Be a Joke," right? That you can find in Hermes Explains, the book, or you can also find it. You were very kind to put that on your Academia page, so people can go there and read this. But you were talking about this history of the concept of laughter, that it begins in the 1950s with the Beat generation, with terms such as Beat Zen, Holy Goof, Zen Lunatic, and Dharma Bums. So I found this very interesting, and I had some questions about it. So if we take a couple steps back, first, can you elaborate on who was behind this and why these terms, such as holy goof, etc., why these terms were used, and kind of expand on that?
Sure. And Stephanie, let me just once again give you a kudos here for your ability to get to the core of things. I have to say, it's so fun talking to you because you really have a clear idea of what the hell you want to know. It's really quite relaxing to be able to talk to someone with such pointed and I think important questions. Well, I should say, of course, that laughter has had a central role in religion, or the social formations of religion, across time and space. I mean, really going all the way back to the beginnings of so-called civilization to present, we find humor appearing, side by side, which was really, I think, the point being made by these Discordians. But for example, if we look at, right now I'm in Massachusetts, so if we think of Native American culture and some of the stories handed down, we have the trickster figure of Coyote. But we'll find the trickster figure really appearing throughout so-called global mythology. So really, humor has always been present in religion, and perhaps not as emphasized by orthodox, hierarchical religious systems.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that we can ignore the fact that humans are things that laugh. This is how Nietzsche defined the human, as the animal that laughs.
Right.
And so throughout time and space, we have laughter playing an important role in the human experience. And, there's been some theorists that really take this as their point of departure. Of course, the number one name to cite here would be Mikhail Bakhtin's Rabelais and His World. Such an important text. It's really difficult to undervalue just how significant this theoretical intervention how Bakhtin's theoretical intervention was in the history of human society. He really emphasizes the productiveness of humor, the productiveness of a sort of folk relationship to official culture, how that folk relationship is often defined by parody, humor, grotesqueries, And so, when I'm really thinking high of myself, I like to think I'm participating in that intervention of really insisting on the importance of humor as an element of human culture. But, Bakhtin wasn't the only one. I'm also thinking of Homo Ludens by the great Dutch philosopher. Huizinga, yes, you perhaps know. In the Dutch context, it's so great to go down like Huizinga Street, in Amsterdam. It's so cool that they have a deep regard for such mirthful philosophers, So I should just start by saying that, right, I'm not the one who discovered this. It's a long tradition of philosophers insisting on the importance of humor. Well, because I'm a historian, and because I'm a historian of esotericism, and because I'm a historian of esotericism that looks at post-war North American culture, my attention gravitated to the Beat Generation, who really seems to stand out with respect to the importance or significance, not only that, but the religious significance that they placed on rowdy humor, laughter, parody, and joking around. And that's indicated by virtue of the fact that you find these neologisms scattered throughout Beat Generation writings. Now here, of course, I'm thinking about the central beats, Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, but we could even go a little bit farther and talk about Gary Snyder, Diana de Prima, Leroy Jones. We can really have a more capacious definition of the Beat Generation. But even if we stick to the core players in that particular literary construct, in the work of Jack Kerouac, for example, he's often described as king of the beats, for better or worse. He has a term that populates his novels, and that term would be holy goof. So in Kerouac's religious worldview, in his Zen Catholic mythoscape, the hero of religion, or the hero of the lived religiosity, is the holy goof, the goofball. And this would be an alternative way of describing the hipster, and I should clarify here, by hipster I don't mean like the latte sipping dickhead with a ponytail that we know today. I'm talking about the originary hipster of the 40s and 50s, and the hipster really emerges, according to my research, the hipster really emerges in the post-war era as a new embodiment of holiness, by virtue of the fact that, in a nutshell, in the eyes of the Beat Generation, establishment religions had failed to prevent the outbreak of successive world wars and deployment of the atom bomb. By virtue of that failure, in the eyes of the Beat Generation, they had no more legitimacy. No priestly hierarchy, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, you name it, none of them had the authority anymore to dictate what was and what was not spiritual. So you had this new spiritual being on the horizon, which was, hip was a reconfiguration of holiness, unbound to any decayed dogmatic structure of religion. So the hipster was this new figure that was, in some sense, authentically religious by virtue of having no attachment to established religions. And so how do you define this new being? Well, Jack Kerouac really claimed that the essence of this new being, the hipster, this authentic religious seeker, was goofing around, which in his mind, he described as an ability to swing with it, the ability to move, a refusal to be bound by conformity, and actually being in touch with the world around, the world that was outside. So it was really a mode of heightened awareness. And it's not just Kerouac. In Allen Ginsberg, famous poet of Hal and Kaddish and America and all these fantastic poems, the hero of those poems is both the goof and what he calls the angel-headed hipster. So this is I think a synonym in a lot of ways for the holy goof. And then, as we allow more people into the sort of beat generation, as we recognize more players within this field, we have different terms. So the Zen lunatic, the Dharma bum, those would be ways of reconceptualizing the hipster, but in these reconceptualizations, emphasizing, for example, the importance of Zen, which the beat generation really found to be a productive mode of shaping their religiosity. So they had Zen lunatic. It's important. They didn't claim to be pious Zen monks in the tradition handed down by XYZ. They were Zen lunatics, so it was their lunacy flavored by Zen. The term also that Kerouac coined would be Dharma bum. So yes, like someone in touch with the Dharma, which is a Buddhist concept. Mm-hmm. However, they were also bringing in the hobo tradition, very much a part of post-war North American culture and even pre-war American culture. But so they were always adding things to, for example, the Buddhist tradition. But of course, the beats were not exclusionary in this regard. Kerouac himself was very much a Catholic Buddhist. Allen Ginsberg was very much a Jewish Hindu Buddhist. And yeah, we could go further. William Burroughs himself would be a post-Buddhist, right, post-Scientological occult weirdo or whatever.
He was in his own zone.
Very much his own thing, but also very much a product. I think that Burroughs is such an impressive character. It's easy to presume that he is sui generis, but very much not. He has his sources too.
Good point. So this new way of looking at the world and at the world that these people are living in at that time also includes drugs. So just to put it very, very succinctly, you also talk about the term psychedelicism, and that this was also an important aspect of this way of thinking. But what do you mean by psychedelicism exactly?
Whether or not, let's just say, to answer your question, I won't dance around it. I think the term psychedelic is overused and ill-defined. Difficult to understand what people mean when they say something. Oh, it's a psychedelic movie, or this is psychedelic music, or psychedelic. Right. The term has been overinflated.
Yeah.
And so this was a very modest proposal on my part, which is, okay, I just want to talk about the specific individuals and groups that make use of the discourse proposed by Aldous Huxley in Doors of Perception, that and specifically that the mind can be expanded. So this is a particular definition of the mind and a particular definition of what they mean by expansion, and ultimately it's a commentary on Gnosis, the way in which Gnosis is achieved. How is Gnosis achieved? Well, it has to do with your mind. So there's a bit of neurological reductionism here, but it's not the mind as neuroscientists today would think about it. The concept of mind that's being made use of here is from psychical research. Psychical research, really C.D. Broad would be the key psychical researcher here that Aldous Huxley was making use of. And then the people who read Huxley who thought, yes, that's the system that I will use when I'm describing what I call Gnosis. So psychedelicism would be a theory of mind from the Psychical Research Society that defines, in a nutshell, the theory of mind being used in Huxley's work is, and he quotes C.D. Broad here in Doors of Perception, is that the mind is like a reduction mechanism. Your senses take in all of this data, far more data than you could make sense of. So, in fact, the mind acts to reduce the amount of data taken in by your eyes and your nose and your mouth and your senses. It reduces the amount of data into a schema that then allows you to be operative in the world. Otherwise, we'd just be so overwhelmed with all of the sense perceptions. We'd be lost in a sea of sensations. No, but so the mind acts as a reduction valve. That's C.D. Broad's idea. And when you use certain chemicals, when you use certain substances, it reduces the reduction valve. So, when you use mescaline, which was the drug of choice in Doors of Perception, Huxley used, he was saying that what the data that would normally be reduced is no longer being reduced. So you're opening up your senses. That's the Doors of Perception thing, which is funny because the title is Doors of Perception, quoting Blake, cleansing the doors of perception. I don't know. Do you cleanse doors? I don't know. It's a funny image, but whatever. So anyways, psychedelicism would be the use of this theory of mind by groups who are attempting to present a religious or spiritual worldview, and not love beads or tie-dye, for example. I would not consider that psychedelicism. I'm really talking about a spiritual ideology here.
Okay. And as an aside, I remember you telling me at one point that you also don't like the term counterculture. Can you talk a little bit about that again? Why you don't like that term?
For a while, it was my honor to be living with John St. Clair, founder of the White Panther Party and manager of the MC5. And, the guy is really a monument in the counterculture. And I remember I was giving a lecture dealing with the counterculture and all that. And I was like, hey, John, can I read you my paper? He's like, sure, of course, whatever. And I'm like, counterculture this, counterculture that. And he's like, oh man, come on, stop with that shit. We were for things. We were trying to remake things. We were seen as counterculture only by the people that thought we were assholes. We were seen as counter by the establishment, but we were trying to offer a new world. So in our eyes, in our point of view, we were counter only insofar as our alternatives were different than what was considered to be normal. And it really bothered him because he's like, that makes it sound negative. And looking into his research, looking into his writings and the writings of, the LSD guy, Timothy Leary, and the writings of the Neo-American Church, Art Kleps. And if you really start to get into the writings of the psychedelic fellowships, the psychedelic churches of the 60s and 70s and 80s, John had a point. Very rarely are there these sort of dust and gravel, rabble rousers that are just talking about breaking down and just no. I mean, a lot of it is innovative, and so, anyways, in a nutshell, I just think that if the key principle of psychedelicism is innovation, there's no point in calling it counterculture.
Okay,
in fact, it just confuses things.
What term then do you prefer to talk about?
Well, this is like the typical scholarly move, right? You deconstruct something,
right,
and then you can, it's way more complicated than we thought. So I'm just going to propose a term for a specific thing that has been organized under the term counterculture, which organizes a lot of other things. So the term I introduce is, when we're talking about the psychedelic church movement, let's talk about the psychedelic church movement, the movement of psychedelic fellowships, or whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
I call it the psychedelic church movement because, for example, I look at a group called the Church of the SubGenius. So, and I also look at another group called the Moorish Orthodox Church and the Neo-American Church. So these groups call themselves churches. I don't think any of my colleagues in the study of religion have a religiometer to determine what is and isn't a religion. I mean, it's not an empirical thing. So if they call themselves churches, I'll call them churches. Fine. I don't care. If that's what they're calling themselves, it just makes sense for me to call them that too.
Okay. Good point. So the things that you were just talking about, you've noted in your writings that all of these ideas led to the hippie movement and the flower power era of the 1960s. So moving into the 60s here. And we have already established that this era is associated with drug use. But you note that there was a specific reason for the use of and viewpoints about psychedelics and why they were important. So can you elaborate on this and how all of this relates back to the concept of humor or laughter? So what were these people trying to achieve with this viewpoint about the nature of the psychedelic?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. As a historian, I moved from the so-called beat generation of the 50s and then into the early 60s, and really where I would see enthusiasm for psychedelicism, enthusiasm for a spiritual path that makes use of a psychical theory of mind as the authentic means of attaining higher knowledge, of spiritual truth, of gnosis. So that specifically, that's what I'm talking about. And then when we go into the hippie era, I think it's important to really clarify that the term hippie and the idea of the hippie era can really be dated to 1967, insofar as the corporate news media glommed onto this thing that was going on in certain bohemian enclaves and up and down the California coast, and in the Midwest, in Detroit and Ann Arbor, and in the East Coast, in New York and Boston, and in Texas and Austin. Anyways, something was going on in these bohemias, and it was attracting more and more attention, and the media got a hold of it, and let's call it the hippies, though there is a bit of a misnomer there, insofar as when you say hippie, you think of like a young person, and you think of all of these stereotypes and tropes, when in fact there was no age gap. There was no these psychedelicists were of all ages and coming from all classes and genders, things like that. But anyways, in 67, you have the media really promoting psychedelicism and promoting this spiritual milieu under the term hippie. And of course, the Summer of Love in 1967 was a media event in many ways. But hey, it worked. It drew a lot of people to California and to New York City and to some of these bohemian enclaves. And when they were drawn there, I think that the massification, if we can use that term, the massification of psychedelicism led to first, an expansion of the milieu, but also the ideas at play within hippie enclaves really became much more diverse, as you'd expect, as more people show up. Also, let's keep in mind, when we use the term flower power, that is in many ways the militant strain that emerges from this massification of psychedelicism. Flower power refers to a subsection of people who were, or at least who saw spiritual advancement or the expansion of consciousness as intimately tied to social action. And when we talk about flower power, what we're talking about is the sort of militant perspective or a militant approach to American society in the 1960s, and the factors that characterized that society. So consumerism, sexism, racism, homophobia, and militarism. Those 5 elements, I think, provide very convenient touchstones for defining psychedelicist militancy, or what we could call flower power. Psychedelic militancy in the 60s, flower power, we could define it according to a rejection of militarism. So a refusal to be drafted into the Vietnam War. That would be big, burning your draft card. So you would see flower power militants mobilizing their own constituents to protest the Vietnam War. The key example here is the levitation of the Pentagon in 1967. But there would be numerous other instances. And then you could go through all the other ones. For example, sex repression. There were love-ins, so that would be an example of how. So each one of these things, sexism, of course, I think that would haunt psychedelicist militants until the early 70s with the women's liberation movement, when that really came into its own. And I think you see a fantastic turning point or sea change. This can be charted, I think, very clearly in Detroit and Ann Arbor with the Red Star Sisters, with Jeannie Parker, Lenny St. Clair. And they, I think, did a fantastic job of showcasing many of what you could call the false consciousness of their comrades in the publications like the Ann Arbor Argus. And anyways, I think that in the Midwest is where that sea change occurred in the most salient way. You could see it happen. And I think their male comrades were very quick to pick up on it. John St. Clair and Pun Plamondon. I think that the White Panther Party represents a fantastic litmus test for the receptivity of women's liberation within psychedelicist militancy. But anyways, how does this relate to laughter? Well, I think that, the expansion of consciousness, a heightening of awareness, is intimately linked to humor, because you realize that serious people are sort of silly. You realize that everything that serious culture takes so serious shouldn't be taken so serious. And how do you find humor in things that people take serious? Well, you're detached from them. You remove yourself from the systems that make these things feel like they have so much gravity. And I think that humor in this respect can be weaponized as a means of expanding consciousness without drugs. I guess this is how humor has been defined. If you look at Bergson's fantastic book on laughter, it's a matter of perspective. The man who falls back in his chair and then ends up in the bathtub. Well, it's not funny for him because it's happening to him, but from another perspective, from a separate perspective, it can be amusing to see that. And so that's how humor was weaponized. And I think the key group here with respect to psychedelicist militancy or flower power in the 60s would be the Yippies, the Youth International Parties. They realized that you could chant and scream all day outside the Pentagon, but that's not really going to endear you to anyone who doesn't already share your beliefs. However, running a pig for president, I mean, say no more. I get it. They're all swine. So I think that they realized that, let's not participate in this system of establishment. Let's take a position outside of that and really lampoon how foolish this entire pantomime of statecraft is. Let's not try to vote someone else in. Let's show them that the entire system of voting is rigged from the start. So you might as well vote for the swine which was the pig that they ran in the 1968 election. The Yippies ran a pig for president, and they named the pig Pegasus. Like Pegasus. Anyways, I think they realized that humor was so much more effective for changing minds. And in many ways, you see it likened to a psychedelic experience without psychedelics. Later, this maneuver would be called mind fucking.
Right. Okay.
And that was a term linked, of course, to the Discordian Society, who had their own approach to using humor to change minds, and not just change minds, but maybe even expand those minds in the process. But here again, we see the psychedelicist theory of mind at play. We see that psychical theory of mind that, not only is spiritual advancement determined by an expansion of consciousness, but changing attitudes. All of it goes back to this concept of mind.
So the psychedelic then in this narrative, as it relates to the expanding the consciousness, this seems like, from what I'm reading and what I'm understanding, that this played a central role in that this was a sacred thing. Correct?
Yeah, well,
or not?
Yeah, it's funny because even, all the way back to the mid-1960s, so really before the massification of hip and the massification of psychedelicist culture takes off in 67 with the Summer of Love. Mm-hmm. Come to San Francisco with flowers in your hair, that sort of thing. Before that, we can look at groups. Really, there's a spectrum here, but for example, Timothy Leary, the psychologist out of Harvard with Richard Alpert, later Ram Dass, and that group they're looked at as really the foremost advocates of psychedelicism, beginning in the mid 1960s and going all the way up to the 70s. And very East Coast, I should say. Leary's approach with his group, and they'd go through a number of different names. They started as the Harvard Psychedelic Society, and then they became IF, and then they became the Castaneda Foundation, and then eventually they became LSD, the League of Spiritual Discovery. Anyways, despite all these name changes, they had one style, let's say, and their style of psychedelicism was very reverent. They used these substances, and they felt that they were gaining religious states of consciousness, mystical states of consciousness that have been described by mystics across the world, across time and space. So they're like, oh, well, that's the language we should use to make it legible to people who have never had this experience. So they'll have some frame of reference. And then they would even create a ritual structure that made use of very familiar religious terms, very familiar, for example, sacrament. That would be a major one. This isn't LSD. This is the sacrament. Okay. So this makes it all very legible. And when it came time to publicizing their particular spiritual path in the, what my old mentor, John Berthrong, called the divine deli or the spiritual supermarket, when they got on the market to promote their wares next to all of the other religious entrepreneurs, they, Leary and his type would say, oh, this is a sacrament. Blah. Anyways, that exists on one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, very West Coast, is the merry pranksters who are like, religion is a joke. They're like, take this. You realize that all the smells and bells, it's a front for them not knowing the mystical type consciousness that we have instantly in this. So why carry all the dead weight of thousands of years of bad consciousness, which they saw as defining religious establishment? Why carry that around? We're new. In their minds, peyote and LSD and DMT gave access to the numinous. We are the future. This is new. This is what it is. There's no reason that we need to garb ourselves in outmoded officialdom. And we don't need, so anyways, on the West Coast, with the acid tests and the merry pranksters and that sort of thing, there was very much for me, it seems kind of California. I don't know, this new age, new style, new potential in humanity. And so, Kesey and his pranksters were less enthusiastic about garbing themselves in religious terminology and instead preferred sort of wacky, demotic terminology to describe what they were doing. Though it should be mentioned that Leary's overly religious discourse and Kesey's demotic vernacular, that's been described as, there's been described as tension there, and there's this famous historical event where where Kesey went to go visit Leary at Leary's psychedelic Vatican, which was this estate in Millbrook, New York. And anyways, Tom Wolfe covered it in Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test and really made a big deal about how they disagreed and how there was no common. And I think later research has illustrated that that's overblown. I think ultimately Kesey was on very friendly terms with Leary, and the pranksters were very close to the LSD people. And for more on that, I would really encourage people to check out Eric Davis's book, High Weirdness, which came out.
Yeah, good reference there. Thank you for mentioning that. Is it something that we can say then that the both of the groups, the West Coast and the East Coast, they both felt that the use of psychedelics granted the person like an instant gnosis, as it were, and they just used different terminology to describe the substance itself, or did they also have different ideas about what the end result was? Of
course they had different ideas, very much so. And I think we can even use a more technical term here. They had different natural theologies, and not just them. I should really clarify that there were dozens of psychedelic outfits with their own natural theologies and their own ritual containers. Not so much competing, because the spiritual milieu was not conforming to the capitalist economy of scarcity. No, you could hold multiple religious titles, and it's actually not so uncommon to find someone in these milieus like Allen Ginsberg being part of the Zenta Church and part of the League of Spiritualists and a merry prankster. They weren't exclusive. But I should say that despite having different ideas, in many ways, yes, the idea was you can take these substances and have access to higher knowledge. However, the key here, and I think this often gets forgotten, is just because you have access doesn't mean you know what the hell is going on.
Right.
I think a lot of these psychedelic entrepreneurs or psychedelic evangelists were very clear about this, but of course the media was totally uninterested. They were very clear, I should say the corporate media was very uninterested, that a level of maturity is essential for experimenting with mind expansion. Just like, and I think Leary was the one to say, just like you wouldn't give a 13-year-old keys to a jetliner plane, you shouldn't give them a LSD session. The groundwork has to be there. Right. And that groundwork depends according to who you're talking to. But, according to Leary, it's like, they need a solid foundation in meditation. They need a solid foundation in prayer. They need a solid foundation in all of the spiritual disciplines that the world religions have made available over the last few thousand years. Now, Merry Pranksters, the Keys, a very different idea. If you know how the acid tests were, it's you showed up to a rock and roll dance and have some of this electric Kool-Aid and wow, And I think that in many ways, both were convinced that they were at the forefront of a new paradigm of human relationships. And here I would just like to indicate, as a historian, I really do need to separate the enthusiasm of these psychedelicists from empirical history, empirical fact. And so I should say that here, I think in their enthusiasm that LSD would be the key to human potential, the key to a new spiritual aeon, so to speak, really reflects, I think, the American exceptionalism that defines U.S. history. This idea of chauvinism, that, America is the light of the world. America is the exception, the great experiment, I think that in many ways, the psychedelic church movement is thoroughly saturated in what we could call the spirit of America or whatever America is as an idea. I think they very much are, totally saturated in that. And in fact, I think that they're actually a unexceptional aspect of religion in North America. And I think that a lot of my work tries to emphasize the fact that they're not this weird, anomalous eruption that occurred. Quite the opposite. I think that the history of this movement goes all the way back to European Romanticism. There's nothing new under the sun, as the good book says. And I don't think, even though they would claim differently, I think it's important to read them within the longer tradition of, well, I suppose we could say esotericism, the longer tradition of meaning making. And so sort of demystify the psychedelic church movement.
Well, that's really interesting, and I didn't think about it in that sense. But if you look back in history to the ancient mystery schools, there was also talk about them using mind-altering substances. The oracles would use some type of I'm not quite certain what substance it was exactly, but for prophecy or for oracles and that type of thing. So it wasn't like mind-altering substances weren't used before this time. That's basically my point. I'm getting at it. Right. So it's really cool. I take your point.
Oh yeah, sorry for interrupting, but it's really cool to keep your finger on these biblical archaeology journals because they're constantly turning up psychoactive substances found in clay shards. A few tens of thousands years old. Actually, it happened recently, but. Yeah, so this idea that humans naturally gravitate to the alteration of consciousness, I don't think that's a controversial idea. I think that humans have a natural affinity for the alteration of consciousness across culture. And when we say drugs, I think it's important to clarify that includes caffeine, it includes alcohol and tobacco and certain alkaloids. But this idea that drugs are a special class of substance is, I think, untenuous, and in fact, and that psychedelic drugs represent a unique menace, if I can put it like that. Right. No, okay. I don't think so.
Okay, very, very interesting point. I'm glad you brought that up. You mentioned already at the beginning with my question about this, the humor and the seriousness that these opposites here, that the concept of sacred laughter was developed further in the 1970s with the formation of the Discordian Society. So. So we've kind of already laid the foundation. Now we can get back to the Discordians and talking about them. Can you expand on this group? I think I've been asking around to people if they've ever heard of the Discordian Society, and a lot of times I get this very puzzled look in return. And some people have kind of, yeah, that sounds familiar. Some people say, no, never heard of it. So, for the listener to give kind of a little of a background of the group, who were the founders, what were they about, what were their goals, and just expand on that so we have an idea of who this group is.
Yeah, and I should mention that there is a fantastic documentary that just came out. Adam Curtis. It really,
that's right. I remember seeing your post
he's a really
about
talented
that.
filmmaker, and his most recent documentary, Can't Get You Out of My Head, actually presents a pretty nice overview of the Discordians and their place in modern American paranoia, or modern American society, or modern Western society.
Yeah. I started watching it.
It's great.
Yeah, I started watching it, and then I didn't get back to it. But yeah, good that you mentioned that. I'll put that in the program notes.
Yeah, it's great. And I should say that some of my friends have written really wonderful things on the Discordians, and I owe a lot of my own understandings of them to writings that, for example, Adam Gorightly, I think, has written very well about this. There's a website called Raw Illumination. My friend Tom Jackson's written a lot about this. Eric Davis and Carole Cusack has that wonderful book, Invented Religions. Though I can't help myself here. I would also encourage people to read my book review of Invented Religions because, right. I'm sorry for the shameless self-promotion. But
no problem.
The Discordians are a really interesting group, I think, in many ways. They do seem to have certain features that are unique. It started in the late 1950s with two high school students from Southern California, Kerry Thornley and Greg Hill, who invent, maybe as many young people do, their own secret religious group, half in jest, called the Discordian Society, where they venerate the goddess Eris, the goddess of discord and chaos. A fun thing to do. As young people are, they're creative and stuff. And the idea is that when Greg Hill and Kerry Thornley looked at the world, they didn't see order. What they saw was chaos, absolute chaos. And anyone who claimed to have a system to organize that chaos was full of shit. It was total madness out there. It was everybody doing everything all the time. And by really setting their vision on chaos, they were able to discern the way in which everyone else was competing to sell you a point of view or belief system, what would later be abbreviated as BS bullshit. Everyone is trying to sell their beliefs, their BS, and by virtue of fixing their gaze on chaos and the goddess of chaos, the outlines of everyone's bullshit became a lot clearer to them. But anyways, and then they both went off to live their life, and as part of that, Kerry Thornley entered the military and served in a Marine base, and while serving, he became friends with a very eccentric person who just transfixed Kerry Thornley, who at the time was very invested in the writings of Ayn Rand, the anarcho-capitalist. And as a Randian, he really saw this philosophy embodied, or at least parts of this philosophy embodied by his friend who he met in the military, Lee Harvey Oswald, and started writing a book about Lee Harvey Oswald because the guy was just so unique, particularly after he defected to the Soviet Union. And the book is called Peaceful Warriors. After getting out of the military, Thornley and Hill reconnect in New Orleans and are really mixing with an interesting crowd there. For more on this, I would recommend people check out Adam Gorightly's work. He's really gotten into this. He has the Greg Hill archive, so he's able to shed light on a lot of this material, which has been somewhat mysterious up to now. Anyways, while in New Orleans, they really reinvest in their Discordian Society because it really seems like a good idea. And with a few more years, they have more mature ideas about what it means to be a Discordian and how chaos really is the underlying principle of reality. And with the assassination of JFK and the fanfare over Lee Harvey Oswald, this really scares Thornley. This is really a moment for him where it was all fun and games, and his radicalism was very much, like most radicals, it's something you talk about, but you never really plan to go all the way. But here is someone who he was very close with, now in the national spotlight for assassinating the president. And this is a turning point in Thornley's view of order and chaos. And so the Discordian Society then, and I should always say that the society was no bigger than 50 people up until the mid-1970s. It really was they want to style themselves as a secret society, but it was really just an unknown society. Okay. Though Thornley and Hill would accumulate a number of very talented co-religionists. And here I'm thinking of Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea. Mm-hmm. And these were friends they met. Both Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea were editors in the Playboy Forum. And all of them get together and they launch a conspiracy or a hoax conspiracy about the Illuminati. And this is what I term the Discordian Illuminati thesis, because there's a lot of people who have a lot of ideas about the Illuminati. And so how do we discuss the ideas that Discordians propagated? And what makes the Discordian Illuminati thesis interesting is that in my research, I've yet to find leftists or anarchists or communists or left-leaning radicals discuss the Illuminati before them. Before Wilson and Shea and Thornley and Hill launched their mindfuck, they launched their hoax, talk of the Illuminati was really centered in the extreme right wing, particularly the John Birch Society and groups, anti-Semitic groups who would link the Illuminati with a Jewish conspiracy or a Jesuit conspiracy. Yeah, so really it was circulating amongst the right. But here, right and left kind of dissolved because Kerry Thornley and Robert Anton Wilson were very enthusiastic about Ayn Rand. Of course, they eventually left that behind, but Ayn Rand is hard to position by virtue of the fact that she is an anarchist writer who is an anarcho-capitalist. So you have this weird conflation of right and left and where do you belong. But anyways, that was a very interesting, they took something from the extreme right and then set it loose in the extreme left. And now you see today, the Illuminati is a very popular meme, very popular discussion point for people all over the political spectrum.
So to kind of take a step back, you mentioned how Thornley was somewhat, was he also like implicated in the whole assassination of JFK? Was he not considered to be a player in the group, or had some kind of association with if he was friends with Oswald, was he also being
wrote a book about him?
Exactly.
I mean, dig that.
So
before,
because I recall that you note in your work how all of the Discordians or the Discordian group were then getting involved into this political side with political objectives, it seems. And it was at this time that this whole Operation Mindfuck came about, because of the fact that Jim Garrison was investigating the assassination, and somehow Discordians got mixed up in that. Because wasn't Jim Garrison, he believed that the Illuminati was a real entity, correct?
Yeah. Well, it's important to keep in mind that Garrison came later. Garrison came a few years after the assassination and was really hailed as a hero in the underground press amongst psychedelicists and heads and fists. They thought, oh, here's someone in the establishment who is attacking the establishment, because, of course, we can't believe Kennedy was assassinated, much in the same way we can't believe that Martin Luther King was assassinated by who the powers that be tells he was. Any of these assassinations, we don't believe it. It's clearly the FBI. And it wasn't Garrison himself, I think, who was really invested in the Illuminati. It was someone on his team, someone very close to him. And Thornley thought, So Thornley wasn't really anything in the original investigation. It was only when Garrison reopened the investigation that he got wind of Thornley and thought, wait a minute, is this Harvey Oswald's double? Is this, what role did he play? Blah, blah, blah. And that's when Thornley thought, well, I'm going to get this guy. You know, this guy wants to give me hassle. This guy wants to really hassle me. Watch this. And so Thornley mobilizes his friendship network. You know, this is the Discordian Society. And they began inundating the Garrison investigation with cryptic notes signed by the, you're getting too close. Back off, you know. And the person on close to Garrison, who was very much invested in this Illuminati idea, a right winger, just totally, you know, didn't know what to think. And it became so humorous to see these establishment types, you know, melting down or whatever. And this tradition really speaks to going back a minute to flower power. This was a mode of pranking that would change someone's mind, that they would inundate this person with so much Illuminati material. At one point, the hope was he would just give up and say, you know, this all sounds like a bunch of BS. This all sounds made up.
So was it kind of a mistake that they got this conspiracy theory angle involved in all of this with the Operation Mindfuck? This wasn't something that they had planned beforehand, I imagine.
Well, pranking, and how do you please the goddess of chaos? Well, you create more chaos. So I think chaos was always valued by the Discordians as a good thing because it tends to loosen up authoritarian structures.
They took the situation as it was presented, and they just took advantage of it basically by creating this whole Operation Mindfuck, and with all of this, all of these little tidbits of information, and as they were presenting themselves to be the Illuminati and all of this, they were just playing into all of the superstitions maybe of the investigators.
Yeah, the imagination of the investigators, but not only that, Operation Mindfuck also included, because Wilson and Shea were editors at Playboy magazine, they also inserted cryptic indications of a ruling cabal of the Illuminati in this mainstream magazine. And that's not the only magazine. A lot of the Discordians at this time were involved in the media. A lot of them were newspaper people. So not only Playboy, but also Teen Set magazine. I mean, if you can imagine such a silly magazine. Teen Set magazine and the Chicago Seed, which was an important underground paper, East Village Other. So yeah, they were seeding these ideas across the media landscape. Not because they had an agenda, but I think to only further accelerate, I guess they were accelerationists in some sense, accelerate the heady zeitgeist of the mid to late 1960s.
I see. And the people that were planting all of these little seeds, this was not made known that, yes, we're a part of the Discordians and this is what we're doing. This was all covert, correct? So all of this information kept popping up all over the place, but nobody knew who the people were that were writing it and who they were connected to.
Right. The funny thing is they would also announce, we are the Discordians, we're doing this. But because that was in the general deluge of misinformation, people thought the Discordians were just another one of these mysterious sects competing for power behind the curtain. So really, and let's not forget, the motto of the Discordian Society is Discordians stick apart. So there was no central committee planning. Everyone associated with the Discordian Society had their own agenda, which they were pursuing with or without the other Discordians knowing. So you could never be sure what was part of Operation Mindfuck. Oh, come on. Let's go levitate the Pentagon. Oh, man, is that real or is that mindfuck? Let's go do this. Is that real? Is that mind? Yeah. So, and it was that state of consciousness that many of the Discordians thought represented the highest form of awareness.
Okay, I'm going to go off on a tangent here as an aside.
Go.
But is this like the groundwork for people like David Icke with his reptilian rulers that are a part of the Illuminati and all of this? I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but this sounds like the stuff that you hear nowadays about the Illuminati with their signals over the eye, and that's supposed to indicate, the particular symbolic messages, and that has something to do with this reptilian race that has taken over the earth and all of that. I mean, is this a part of it, like a natural extension of what started with Operation Mindfuck?
I don't think so, insofar as at least a lot of the Discordians pursued this agenda with humor in mind. Ultimately, they were so tied to this outrageousness, to this deep suspicion of anything being true. And then that leading you to the awareness that, oh my God, this is so ridiculous. Like I can't pursue this with a straight face any longer because it's just so silly.
Yeah. So
so that
gotcha.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go on.
No, David Icke is not purporting this as some kind of joke. He's dead serious.
He seems somewhat humorless in a lot of ways.
Very serious. So I can see how that wouldn't really fit
perhaps,
with their mindset.
Yeah, we could think of the Discordians as an intervention into what is a long tradition of occultism or even occult paranoia.
Mm-hmm.
The Discordians were an intervention into that type of hysteria that we can trace all the way back to the French Revolution. This idea that there is a secret cabal working. The Discordians appear on the scene very much in that conversation, but as jokers. I think that when it comes to defining how the Discordians place themselves with respect to truth, there's a line from the Illuminatis, and I think I'm going to get this right, that nothing is true unless it makes you laugh, but you don't really understand it until it makes you cry. So anything that you present to them is itself inherently absurd. For example, the Illuminati. How do they think about the Illuminati? You're at a cocktail party, someone turns over to you and be like, the entire government is run by the Illuminati. That's just ridiculous. It's going to make you laugh. But then you start thinking about it. It's like, oh my God, this person believes that. That's really painful. That must be a very difficult reality to live in. And then you would cry. So this would be the Discordian perspective on reality.
Okay.
That anything anyone tells you, that God is this ethereal being that lives upstairs and throws light, anything, the American government is the purveyor of democracy, whatever claim you want to use as an example, first it's enough to make you laugh. And then I think if you think about it long enough, for example, David Icke or QAnon, its stuff is really quite outrageous. But if you think about it long enough, you're like, oh my God, but by virtue of believing that,
I see,
it may make life on Earth more difficult to live.
Regarding the documentary by Adam Curtis titled Can't Get You Out of My Head, that you can find on Curtis's YouTube channel, I'd like to add a bit of clarifying information to help contextualize what Christian was talking about earlier. Curtis's film is looking at how people, in an age of individualism, respond to power systems and corruption, and the tensions and frustrations that arise when people try to enact change in such a system. In the first installment of the documentary, he focuses on the fear and paranoia that the political extreme right in Cold War America had created with Thor on communism, and the ideologies associated with it. This paranoia led to the creation of conspiracy theories about the American government, one of which was focused on the Bavarian Illuminati, who allegedly wanted to destroy democracy. And this is ironic, as the Bavarian Illuminati was a utopian movement that wished to replace religion with reason. In any case, out of this environment arose the Discordian Society that rejected old systems of power and wanted to free people from being controlled. So, the Operation Mindfuck that Christian was talking about was the experiment that Carrie Thornley started with some other people to show society how absurd conspiracy theories were. According to Adam Curtis, all of the stories that were being planted in various media by Thornley and company was Thornley's attempt to break the spell of believing in these ridiculous theories regarding the Illuminati. Because in Thornley's thinking, who could possibly believe that an 18th century group was really the secret rulers of the modern world? That was Thornley's point. As Curtis shows in his film, however, people didn't seem to get it. There is a lot more that is discussed in the film, including how MKUltra was a kind of grotesque flip side of the way Discordians were thinking about power and control, so I would highly recommend watching this docuseries for a broader context. I'm still working my way through it, but the first installment covers all this stuff that I just mentioned. Part 2 continues to follow the development of the Discordians in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, how science fiction fans became introduced to their ideas, how Discordians adapted to cyberspace. Christian starts interviewing me at a certain point, and we even reminisce about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Hope you'll join us for more.